guys, hope you had a great week moving and grooving into the first week of August. Our family just went on our first real vacation. Can you believe it? Our first real vacation that had nothing to do with work or weddings or anything else. And it was awesome. And I'm going to write some tips that I learned for Smarter Travel about traveling with toddlers because we had a little bit of everything on this trip, including a few mimosa moments that I will reveal over the next several weeks, like this one. I was a little worried, of course, about flying with a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old on a plane for 8 hours. What's to worry about, right? Everything. But things were going good. We got on the plane right before nap time. We're cozy. We're ready to go. Everyone's seated on the plane. The pilot has welcomed us. We're going to make it. That's what I was thinking. We are going to make it. And then right before we're supposed to take off, the pilot comes on and tells us that they can't file their flight plan. So we actually stayed at the gate for 2+ hours before this 8-hour flight. So that 8-hour flight actually was more like an 11-hour flight on the plane. And I was in communication with American Airlines on Twitter because we actually had a great rep when we checked in all of our luggage. And I think it's good to, give a shout out to someone that deserves a shout out. And I mentioned to American Airlines that we were sitting at the gate for 1, 2, almost 3 hours. And I said, one way to fix this, if you really cared about us, would be to send mimosas. They did not do that, but I thought it was a really good suggestion. They had an opportunity to be a hero, but they did not take it. So it was mimosa moments to start off the trip and a few mimosas on the trip, but overall it was a great experience. So back in the swing of things here at Smarter News, and there's really a lot of interesting news this week and a few things I want to recap before we get to our interview. But one of the top stories I think is really important, of course, is always the economy. And we got a jobs report on Friday. The economy looks good. The job market looks good. One of the things I was watching, though, is wages, because in previous job reports, there's been some question about whether or not wages are going up enough for the American worker to really see some benefit. And we're seeing some data points besides the jobs report this week that show that wages are growing, and that's a good thing for the job market. We're seeing that a little bit more in this jobs report. So I'm paying attention to wages, and it looks like they're moving up, and that's good for the economy. Moving up enough that workers are feeling it. Also, of course, when we look at the economy, we cannot ignore Apple this week. The first $1 trillion company worth more than certain countries' GDP. But there is a side story I think you should pay attention to. And there's been, some are calling it a smear campaign from China. But the Chinese state media really has come after Apple this week ahead of their earnings report and saying things like, Apple is putting things that they shouldn't on their Apple stores and just trying to make Apple look bad. I don't know if there's validity to the reports, but they're coming from the Chinese state media. And why is that important? Because, we're in a little bit of a trade face-off with China because America has levied tariffs on China and China has done the same to us. And so trade tensions are high. And so it's something to watch when it comes to Apple because clearly that's a huge consumer base, the Chinese market, but also Apple makes a lot of its products in China. So just a reminder that even though you're worth $1 trillion, it doesn't mean you're immune to change. And Apple said so much in their earnings call of saying, they felt confident, but things can change. So something to watch there. And here's the biggest story of the week, a story I feel that gets buried time and time again. So I really want to take a second to talk about it. And in order to talk about it, we have to go back to December 2015 in Ukraine. Remember what was happening in Ukraine at the time. Russia marched in, said Crimea is ours. The world said no. Russia said yes. And quote unquote, war ensued in that part of the world. And during that time, a passenger plane was shot down over Ukraine, and many blamed Russia and still do. Nearly 300 people, innocent people, died in that event. So this was a very serious time in Eastern Europe. And in 2015, it was no different, though the world was sort of turning its attention away. because that happens often, I've noticed, with stories that involve Russia. There's a lot of debate, a lot of emotion, but nothing really comes of it. I mean, think about that. A passenger plane was shot down by Russia. And besides sanctions, nothing else really happened. Now, I'm sure there are those that will argue those sanctions were really powerful and really hurt the economy. But 300 people died. So keep that in your mind. So let's go. Middle of December 2015 in Ukraine, 250,000 people in Western Ukraine lose power for 2 days. How cold is it in Ukraine in the middle of December? It's cold, an average of 30 degrees. So they're losing power and it's cold. And they can't figure out how to get their systems back on. And just like the plane that was shot down, Russia is blamed for this. Russian hackers specifically. And according to reports, these Russian state hackers were in the systems in Ukraine for at least 6 months, poking around trying to figure out where the vulnerabilities of the system were, and they found it. So why am I bringing this up? Well, this week there was a big security summit hosted by the Department of Homeland Security in New York City. And some of the topics are very familiar that they talked about. They reemphasized yet again that Russia meddled in our election, and they're worried about Russia meddling in our elections again. But over the last several months, including in this last news cycle, another side of this story of Russian meddling came up. And it's a warning that Russian state hackers have actively infiltrated parts of our infrastructure in America. In fact, one report suggests that Russian hackers got into the control centers of nuclear power plants. So think of all the energy that's gone into Russia meddling in our election. And that's a really important story, by the way. I'm not trying to dismiss it. We've certainly covered it on SmartHER News. We'll continue to cover it. But imagine if we put equal energy into the Russians trying to hack into our infrastructure and the effect of that. Imagine parts of the East Coast losing power for a few days in the dead of winter. What is that going to look like? And what is the possibility of that? It's a scary thought. And while the government has identified these Russian state hackers, the extent of those hackers' knowledge or ability to remote control from the outside certain parts of our power supply isn't known. So, wrapping this all together, if the Russians shot down a plane, a passenger plane, what else are they willing to do? I think this is really serious. And again, this story has come up about the Russians and our power infrastructure really over the last several months. And one of the things I want to look into next week is someone who could talk to us about the solution. How do we combat that? How do we go on the offense? Because it seems like we're playing a lot of defense, especially when it comes to the meddling in our elections. By the way, that word meddling drives me crazy. How many times do you use meddling in a normal conversation? Never. And now we're using it all the time. It's a very vague term, isn't it? Like you're meddling, but what exactly does that mean? So I'm going to try to stop using it. I should, drop a coin into something somewhere and donate it or something. It drives me totally crazy. But listen, this story about Russia is really important. I think it's something we have to pay attention to, and we're going to do so here on SmartHER News. So we're going to switch gears here a little bit and talk about the story that kicked off this week's news cycle. Another really tough story to talk about, but one that I think we have something to add to. And of course, I'm talking about the story of Bodie Miller, an Olympic skier, and his wife, who lost their sweet little 19-month-old girl to a drowning accident. And they finally revealed for the very first time in an interview what happened. And I have to tell you, as a parent, my heart just broke for them, because I know, like any parent knows, exactly how in a moment you can lose track of your toddler. It's happened to me more than once. I hate to admit it, but it has. And one of the many reasons the Millers were speaking out is to be a reminder to parents about drowning prevention. And I give them a lot of credit for doing that. They want to prevent other parents from going through the horror that they are experiencing. And this is really important because 3 children die every day from drowning. August is one of the worst months in the United States for drowning. So I am certain they are doing good, even in a terrible situation that I wish they never had to face. And their bravery inspired me because part of the mission of Smarter News is to also share smarter products, ways for us to live smarter. And I have a small pool in our backyard, and I was really frightened about having it, about living in a house that had a pool. And I found a company online called Katchakid. And I shared some of these photos on social media this week because it looks like a big spider web over my pool. It doesn't sound pretty, but it looks pretty cool. And it does exactly what the company says. It catches your kids. It keeps your kids out of the pool. So if they fall in this net, it catches them. And I really cannot say enough good things about it as a consumer. I've had it for, a year now, and I really like it. So I recommend it. The story behind the company, though, is really fascinating to me, and how the family that created this company took a tragedy that they experienced and invented a solution. So I reached out to Katchakid, and I was lucky enough that they agreed to chat with me. And we had a conversation with Claire Essen. She's one of the family members in the company. We talked about the company's history, its remarkable origins, and why pool safety really matters. And surprisingly, their story begins in Africa. Take a listen.
My father-in-law is from Zimbabwe, and he had a sports equipment manufacturing and supply company, and they built soccer nets and football bladders and golf clubs and that kind of thing. So after a tragedy with one of their friends, at that point, my husband was 4, and he obviously thought, "My goodness, this can like anyone who has an accident, it's really this can happen to you. This can happen to anyone. This can happen within my circle, within my family, my friend circle." And so he began thinking of how a pool could be effectively covered, and at that point, he obviously had soccer nets available. So the prototype was sort of like a net over the pool, coming from the sort of like the soccer material, and then he perfected it, and it got built. And on the original nets had nothing in the middle. They had no tensioning system. You had to like really crank it on by hand. Then it went to some sort of spring system in the middle, and and then he developed the keyhole anchor system, and it just began to grow, and it became a very effective way of securing a pool, lightweight, maintaining visibility. One person can use it, and it developed. Then they moved down to South Africa, brought the product to South Africa, and then finally brought the product over to America and parts of Europe.
So let me go back to a couple of different points that you make. First of all, it's interesting to know your husband's family's from Zimbabwe. And where are you from originally? Where's your accent from?
So I'm from Bath in England.
Okay, so this is interesting. I have to share this funny story. When I had first called Katchakid to look at a net for our pool, I talked to a couple different people, all with different accents, all with a Texas with a Texas number, but definitely not Texan accent. And I had and it was really fascinating to know. I knew that there was a South Africa connection, a Zimbabwe connection. Now I'm hearing your accent, so
I know.
It's very cool.
Well, I think I often say to people, we must be one of the only companies where we brought a product from Africa to America. I mean, there can't be that many that came this way, or few.
So did all the first nets start in Zimbabwe and then to South Africa? Is that
Yes.
kind of okay? And when I was reading on the website, and you mentioned it a little bit as well, the accident that happened sounds all too familiar. And I know your husband was very young at the time, but what do you know about what happened? Because on the website, there's a reference to, hey, this happened while everyone was standing around at a party. Like the adults were all there, and yet still there was an accident.
Well, I think it's a common thing. It's exactly what happens to most people is that you're temporarily distracted. And it was as far as I'm aware, it was a party, there were people around, and exactly the same thing as the Bodie Miller story. It's, you're temporarily distracted, you turn around, blink of an eye stuff, and and you can't change it, you can't take it back. So it's something that we hear often. The Pool Safely campaign, which is the national campaign, they hand out water watcher cards, and a lot of drowning prevention advocacy organizations do the same things, water watcher cards, so that that person is wearing the card as a physical reminder that they're responsible for the pool at a party. And it's one of those things that just really should happen anywhere there's a pool that's not barriered.
I've never thought about that, and that sounds like a great idea. I didn't know that part about the net coming from the idea of a soccer net, which is really cool because now I
Well,
can
it was
totally
materials
see
on
it.
hand.
Yeah, I could totally see that now. I mean, I can see the beginning. So I shared some photos online and talked a little bit about the Katchakid net. But if you've never seen it before, how would you describe it to somebody about how it looks and how it works?
Right. So basically it's kind of like a large tennis racket that goes over the pool. So you can't get tangled up in it because it's under tension like a tennis racket. Although it's not rigid, it has flexibility. And it basically works like a horse or cattle guard at the edge of a field. The mesh squares are big, sufficient in size that a small crawler would feel uncomfortable moving forward onto the net. So um they would be held or at the side of the pool. And then obviously a bigger child with better gross motor skills would be able to get to more into the middle of the net, but if they're that old, then they can just use the net as a guide to just get back off.
Yes,
So
my son is. By the way, I've seen the evolution of that because my son just started walking when we got the net, and now he's 3.5. And I just looked around the other day, and he was kind of Spider Manning across the net, and I thought, okay, I mean, this is not what it's intended for, nor do I think this is helpful. But he, even though I
he can
don't
use it
want
as a
him doing
guide,
it, it is a
right?
guide. Yes, exactly. He was reaching for something that he
And
wanted, and then he got off of it.
right. And it's not there's really nothing that a child can gain from the net other than sort of like if they want to sit at the side and stick their feet in to get wet, because it's not bouncy, it's not stretchy. The material is slightly abrasive, so they can't run, jump on it, play on it. It would not be comfortable for them. We had a university do a study on optimum sizing, and that's where we came in with our sizing. In fact, France, years back, they mandated for some unknown reason that netting material should be 2-inch mesh squares, and we wouldn't conform to that because at that, then the smaller the mesh squares, the more a crawler could crawl, and obviously we believe children should be off the hazard, not on it.
And is it true that you have, and I'm gonna knock on wood just because I feel like I need to, because it's like such a stunning statistic that I don't want to like jinx us, but that the people that have bought and used the net, you've never had a household with a fatality with the
No,
net.
never.
Wow.
Never. I mean, with the net on the pool,
Of
never.
course, right.
Yeah.
And what is the price range so people know like what kind of an investment it is?
It depends obviously on the pool size and also the pool complexity. So the simpler the pool, obviously the less labor, etc., and materials. So, but I would say an average price range would be somewhere from about $1,500 to $2,400.
Yeah, I think I remember it being around that amount for our pool, and at the beginning thinking, oh, that's so much money, and now thinking, well, we couldn't have the backyard without it.
I think once you have a pool net on a pool, it's amazing how much peace of mind that gives you. I know when my children were small, this is the product that I used, and and I just know when it was on, the reassurance was really there. I know if I lost sight of a child for a minute or so, I would probably still panic and look at the pool, but I love that about the pool station. It really does give peace of mind, and I think peace of mind and effective barriering is super important.
I
You need to have the
absolutely.
two.
One of the things I've mentioned is that when we're talking about the Katchakid net, or we're talking about solutions when we're seeing stories that are really tragic or terrible. It's not to say, well, hey, see, they should have had this. Why didn't their neighbor's pool have this? It's just to say, hey, there's actually some products that exist out there that even if you have a neighbor that has a pool, you could say, hey, have you seen something like this? And I think that the awareness that just it even exists is really important. Have you had to do any, like, do you do a lot of interviews? I was surprised that people aren't talking to you all the time, considering some of the things that we've seen in the news lately. And just, I can't believe that I just stumbled upon you guys on the internet.
I think the thing is uh, with drowning awareness or drowning prevention awareness is that you think you have the time. You think that we'll get to it. We think, oh, you know what, we're watching. And sometimes maybe you're going to be fine. It's who knows who's going to be lucky and who's not. And I think the thing with drowning prevention awareness is just saying to people, you know what, you really, really need to do something. I mean, if accidental injury, drowning is the number one cause of accidental injury deaths in under fours. When you think how many swimming pools are there in America, it's a very small percentage of homes that have pools. But that statistic is number one. How many cars are there? Why are auto vehicle accidents not number one? It tells you that a pool is a super dangerous place. And so really, you really, really need to safeguard your pool. You need to do something, whether it's a net or a fence or alarms or bolts on your door, whatever it is, something needs to be done because statistically, it's a dangerous place.
Yeah, it's a great reminder. Thank you so much to Claire Essen and the entire Essen family for creating such an amazing product, but also for joining us here on Smarter News. If you have a smarter product that you think we should talk about on the podcast, please let me know. I'd love to take a look at it. And if you have any news stories that you want us to check into, please, this is made to order news. Email me, info@smarternews.com. I can't wait to hear from you. I am Jenna. I am the her in Smarter News, or at least I try to be. And I'm so grateful for your support of our news site. I look forward to talking to you next week. Until then, have a great one.